The mountains had a way of swallowing men whole. They rose in endless folds of shadow and stone, their ridges sharp as broken glass against the horizon. Pines clung to the slopes like green fur, but their needles whispered with a mournful sound, as if they knew how many travelers had vanished among them. A weary man came upon this country when the day was half spent and his strength nearly gone. He had not meant to wander here. His road had ended without warning, washed out by flood, or perhaps never meant to carry him beyond the valleys he had crossed. What remained was little more than a game trail cutting into the woods, narrow and uncertain, winding its way toward the deeper heart of the mountains. The air grew colder the higher he went, colder still with each step into the pines. The sun, though bright above the tree line, never seemed to touch the forest floor. A damp chill seeped into the bones, and the smell of wet earth hung thick. Birds grew scarce, and soon even their cries fell away. In their place came the sound of his own boots against the ground, the crunch of leaf litter, the crack of a root hidden beneath moss. It was a silence that pressed inward, the kind that made a man feel unwelcome. Yet the path called him forward. It bent and curved, vanishing around rocky shoulders, only to reveal itself again, faint and uncertain. No cart had ever rolled here, no stone had been set to mark it, and still it carried the feel of a road, a way meant for travelers, though none had passed in many years. As the woods closed in, the trees grew older. Their trunks rose massive and black, scarred by storms of a century ago. Roots coiled like serpents across the soil, forcing each step into a stumble. The canopy thickened until the sky was nothing more than a gray smear glimpsed between branches. He could not tell whether the day was waning or the forest simply refused to give it light. The land sloped upward again, and the path clung to its side. A cliff fell away to the right, its depth swallowed by mist. A river could be heard somewhere below, roaring unseen, its voice echoing against the walls of stone. The sound rose and fell as he walked, until it seemed to move with him, following. Time became strange on that road. It stretched, bent, folded back. The man did not know how long he had been walking, only that each step took him further from the world he knew. The forest grew denser still, until the path itself began to vanish beneath a carpet of needles. He wondered if he had strayed, but whenever he turned to look behind, the way back appeared clear enough. It was only ahead that the trail dissolved, as if reluctant to reveal its end until the last possible moment. Then came a change in the air. The chill softened. The trees thinned. A faint brightness touched the world, dim but promising. He pressed forward, heart beating quicker, boots heavy with mud. At last the forest broke. The man stepped from its shadows into a clearing, and the sight before him made him stop. There, nestled in a hollow of the mountains, lay a town. It seemed to appear all at once, as though conjured from the mist itself. Weather-beaten rooftops rose from the clearing, their shingles warped by long seasons of rain and frost. Smoke drifted from a handful of chimneys, thin and gray, as though reluctant to declare the presence of life. Dirt lanes wound between the houses, leading to a small square where a stone well sat crooked and half-sunken. Beyond it all stretched more of the mountains, their slopes crowding close, hemming the settlement in from every side. No road led out, none that could be seen. The place looked forgotten, left behind by the world. Time had passed over it like a storm, leaving buildings sagging and fences broken, but somehow it endured. Gardens clung to the edges of yards, woodpiles lay stacked with care. The faint sound of livestock carried from somewhere unseen, a bleating goat, the low murmur of a cow. And yet no figure walked the lanes. The town, though alive in its way, held a silence so deep it might have been abandoned. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain. The mountains behind him loomed dark, the forest still whispering its warnings. Ahead lay shelter, a promise of fire, of food, of rest. a place that breathed, even if faintly, while the wilderness behind threatened to choke the breath from him. He stepped forward. The earth beneath his boots changed from moss to packed dirt, from forest floor to the worn ruts of a path trodden by human feet. The air smelled of wood smoke and old timber, of animals and tilled earth. The square grew clearer, the well leaning at its center. Houses revealed themselves in greater detail, windows shuttered, doors crooked on their frames, porches sagging with age. A church spire rose above them all, pale and weathered, its bell dark with rust. Still no one emerged to meet him. No child peered from behind a fence. No dog barked at the intrusion. The town seemed to watch him in silence, its many windows like eyes unblinking, following each step. A wind stirred. It swept through the lanes, carrying with it the sound of something distant, a creak, a faint shift of wood, as though the place sighed at his arrival. The mountains echoed it back in low murmurs, deep and hollow. The traveler reached the center of the square and paused. His breath rose in a pale cloud before him. His limbs ached, yet the silence pressed too heavily for him to rest. He turned slowly, taking in the place from every side. It looked as though it had been forgotten not just by men, but by time itself. The forest beyond the clearing leaned close, as if eager to reclaim what had been taken from it. The mountains towered above, their ridges like jagged teeth enclosing the hollow. There was no clear path forward, no road winding down to the valleys below. The town sat caged in stone and shadow, hemmed in by wilderness so vast it might as well have been another world. And in that moment a strange certainty settled upon him. This was no accident of wandering. He had not stumbled here by chance. The road that had led him through the forest, that twisting, vanishing trail, had not been built by nature alone. It had carried him here with purpose, drawing him inward as though by invisible hand. The town had been waiting. He could feel it in the air, in the stillness that pressed upon his skin. This place had a weight to it, a presence, as though it had been watching long before he ever arrived. Above, the sun slipped behind the ridges, and shadow filled the hollow. One by one, the chimneys released thicker smoke, rising in thin columns to vanish into the dusk. Somewhere, faintly, a door creaked open. The man did not turn to see who had stepped forth, for he knew the truth even then. He was no longer a traveler on the road. He had arrived. Morning did not arrive in the valley so much as seep into it. Light, pale and uncertain, filtered down the slopes and pooled among the rooftops as though the town were a bowl set beneath a reluctant sky. The traveler rose stiff from uneasy rest, aware of the weight of unfamiliar air in his lungs, aware, too, of the hush that lay over everything, a hush not born of absence, but of attention. The place felt awake before he was, as though it had stirred at some earlier hour to take its first measuring look at him. He stepped out onto the lane. Frost clung to the edges of fence rails and the rims of window panes, a lace of white that melted where the sun managed to touch it. Chickens moved through a yard without enthusiasm, feathers puffed against the cold. Farther off, a milk cow steamed like a small stove in the chill. The traveler moved quietly, careful not to disturb the brittle morning, but even his care could not undo the sense that his presence had already been registered, considered, and recorded. Faces appeared as if lifted on a slow tide. A curtain drew back and a pair of eyes watched. A door opened the width of a palm, and a figure stood within the pocket of darkness, the shape of a shoulder, a cheek. Here and there someone crossed a lane with a basket or a pail, not hurrying, not lingering, each person carrying the same spare economy of motion that belonged to people long trained by hard places. When their gazes found him, there was no surprise, only a turning of the face, a measuring, and something else, recognition. He felt it strike him in the chest like a hand pressed gently but firmly there. They knew him. They knew him in the way of kin greeting a relative who has been gone a long time and finally returned. He could not remember telling anyone his name. The realization came like cold water down the spine. He touched the inside pocket where a worn card bore his details, a habit born of road and border and the blunt questions of strangers. No one here had asked for it. No one had needed to. Still, as he walked past the well in the square, the old iron handle glistening with thaw, he saw a chalkboard leaned against the stone lip. It carried numbers once used to tally buckets and rations, faint sums written and erased until the slate wore a permanent fog of arithmetic. Newer writing threaded through the fog, clear and certain. The date, if dates mattered here, and beneath it a list of tasks. At the bottom a fresh line had been added. It carried his name, written in a hand that had never before shaped that word, and yet formed it cleanly, as though practiced. He stood before the slate and felt the town's attention narrow like a pupil. A wagon wheel creaked somewhere behind him. A sparrow released a two-note sound and flew. He reached to wipe the letters away, then let his hand fall. The chalk would leave a ghost of the word even if he smudged it. Smudges never fooled the places that truly wished to remember. He moved on. Along the lane, a building announced itself without need of signboard. The odor of dry grain, oil, and iron filings drifted through an open window. Barrels stood outside in neat ranks, a general store or something like it. He pushed the door and felt the give of a well-worn threshold. Inside, the room held the quiet of practical things. A scale heavy as a promise, a counter polished by forearms, shelves that carried goods at measured intervals, flour, salt, tinned meat, twine, lamp oil. A wall near the back displayed a dozen wooden frames, each holding a sheet of faded paper. He drew near and saw lists upon lists. Family names appeared in columns, each with a cluster of given names beneath, all written in the same even hand across years. The ink aged from black to brown and then to a sepia that looked more like memory than record. He recognized at once the rhythm of the surnames. They repeated, cycling with the steadiness of seasons, 3 or 4 principal roots from which every branch seemed to grow. A bell lifted and fell somewhere behind the counter, an old signal cord tugged by an unseen arm. The traveler did not turn. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous movement in an unfamiliar place was the one that signaled fear. He kept his eyes on the frames. At the bottom of the last sheet, a thin space had been left, as if the record-keeper trusted in the future's predictability. The space was no longer empty. A final line had been inked with care. It carried his family name and his given name beside it, arranged with the ceremony of a vow. The date followed, precise. Then a small mark he could not interpret, a tiny sigil like a branch with 3 forks. He stood in the inventory of his own existence and felt the strangeness move through him. Others had arrived before him, it seemed, and the store knew them all. The walls had a way of absorbing lives and making shelves of them. He stepped back into the morning with the feeling of having left some portion of himself behind, catalogued and assigned. On the far side of the square, the church's spire lifted, weathered wood silvering under daylight. He approached without intent and found a board mounted by the entry. It bore notices under small roofing shingles, their edges scalloped like fish scales. A baptism listed, a marriage recorded, a death marked with a black X, the dates stepping down the board in a slow cadence. The surnames repeated, again and again, until the letters themselves seemed less like words and more like patterns on a woven blanket. Twice he found a surname nearly his own, off by a letter or two, like a shadow moving beside him at the edge of sight. Between the notices, a wide parchment displayed the outline of a tree. The trunk rose from the bottom, generous with rings, and the branches climbed in ordered, careful forks. At every split, a name had been written, tiny and patient, The bark of an entire town peeled back to show its grain. The tree was full, crowded to the tips with names that doubled back, interlaced, met again as cousins married cousins, and the mountain folded families upon themselves until any 2 points were only a few steps apart. The topmost branch ended in a space left blank, the paper pale there. The blank felt hungry. He turned from the church and followed a lane that narrowed, curving behind a cluster of houses. Barns appeared, their doors open like mouths, their interiors shadowed and warm. The smell of hay and animal comfort lay thick. Children's chalk marks adorned a low stone wall, sun-faded stars and ladders, and a hopscotch grid abandoned mid-game. At the end of the lane, the ground rose into a small hill shaved clean of brush. Beyond it lay a meadow trimmed by careful scything. A fence stitched its boundary, each post capped by a smooth river stone. He recognized the place before he reached it. The town's dead had been given the hill. The cemetery resembled a ledger laid flat, rows upon rows, the stones small and even, faces turned toward a single compass point as if listening. Lichen worked its patient mathematics across names. The traveler walked the aisles with the caution of one who knows he trespasses. The same surnames rose and fell, recombining, repeating, a litany that made the mouth form the same shapes in different years. Entire generations seemed to fold into one another here, not erased, but layered until individuality thinned and lineage stood in its place. He paused at a stone so new the chisel marks still showed their white freshness. The surname was familiar now, as a drum beat is familiar, and below it the given name was his own, spelled precisely. The dates did not belong to him, not yet. The gap between them awaited its second digit. He did not touch the stone. Touching would make it too real. He listened instead. The town had a hum to it, sensed more by the bones than the ear. Work carried on, the kind of labor that made survival possible and conversation unnecessary. Axes lifted and fell somewhere in the band of trees that rimmed the hollow. Water sloshed in buckets. A horse shifted and stamped. Over it all lay that same attentiveness. A lattice stretched across the bowl of the valley. He stood in the center of it as a caught thing might stand in a snare whose knots were too fine to see. When he returned to the square, the chalkboard at the well had been wiped clean and written again. The tasks had reorganized themselves, the numbers marched into new columns. His name had moved higher on the slate. A second mark stood beside it, the same forked sigil. The handwriting remained steady, though he sensed it did not belong to a single hand. The town wrote in one script the way a choir learns a common pitch. Even the smallest of its gestures aligned toward a single purpose, absorption. Afternoon bent toward evening without announcing the moment it crossed the line. The traveler traced the lanes once more, paying attention to corners and gutters and the underside of porches, the places where a settlement keeps its truths. He found an iron trap mended with copper wire, its teeth gently blunted. He found a bundle of willow switches braided and hung above a threshold with the reverence of a charm. He found, beneath a porch, a wooden box fitted with a sliding panel, the panel carved with that same three-forked sign. Within the box lay folded paper, and within the paper lay a braid of human hair, tied with thread the color of dried blood. He replaced everything as he had found it, and let the porch shadow release him. The mountains stood closer now, their ridges purple, their hollows blue-black. The town gathered itself from nightfall, with the same patient economy it had shown all day. Lamps came alive behind glass. Smoke lifted in taller threads. A dog's chain clicked once and settled. The traveler felt the last of the daylight slip over his shoulders like a shawl being withdrawn. He could name the feeling at last. It was not threat, nor welcome, nor even curiosity. It was claim. The town claimed him the way a tree claims water through the finest hairs of its roots, unseen, inevitable, constant. The faces at the windows had held it. The chalkboard announced it. The records in the store preserved it. The cemetery promised its completion in time. He had arrived in a place that did not mistake him for a passerby. It knew the shape of him and had already made a space. Night gathered. The bell in the church tower, dark with rust, did not ring. It did not need to. Everyone here moved by a rhythm too deep for metal. He stood at the square's center and lifted his eyes to the sky. Stars broke through the valley's thin, gauzy cloud. Their light landed on rooftops, on fences, on the well's rim, on the chalked letters of his name. He understood then that no introduction would ever be necessary. The town had never needed him to speak. It had always known who he was. Snow had not yet arrived, but the air carried its warning. Frost threaded the fence rails, and the roofs wore a dull sheen, like breath gone still. By mid-morning, the town had uncoiled into its day. Split wood stacked, smoke moving through the chimneys in pale ropes. A cow's lowing lifted and left to fade against the ridge. The traveler followed the smell of paraffin and bagged grain toward the square, and the building that did most of the town's speaking without raising its voice. The general store stood with the quiet authority of a courthouse and the careful thrift of a pantry. Inside, the light came through glass rippled by old manufacture, laying wavy panes across the shelves. Floorboards took his weight and gave back their soft, tired complaint. Bins of nails sat beside sacks of flour and salt, each sack tied with the same neat knot, the tails cut to the same length, as if obedience to a small order kept larger chaos obedient. A wall clock that never moved stared over it all like a lidless eye. The traveler noted the absence of money on the counter. No till, no drawer, only a ledger that had grown fat on names and figures and the steady arithmetic of keeping. He drifted to the aisle of lamp oil and twine, a safe country of objects that behaved as expected, and let the store's other traffic pass around him. People entered and left with a sound like moth wings, a scrape of boot, a murmur, the whisper of paper folded and tucked away. They moved in pairs that were also families, in singles that were also pairs, the lines of kinship braided so thoroughly that even the simplest errand carried 3 surnames behind it. The store took them in and returned them quieted, sealed, as though some binding had been tightened while they stood at the counter. The ledger opened and closed with the weight of judgment. When it opened, a hand he could not see turned pages that made a damp, homesick sound. Names were written in a script the town shared between them, the same hand by virtue of the same habit, the pen lifted and set down with the regularity of a loom. He felt, rather than heard, the shapes of the words that rose from that book. They were not prices but obligations, not purchases but joinings. Each entry aligned in columns labeled with plain nouns that did not announce themselves: keeping, owing, owing returned, grain, lamp, time. His own name lived there now. He knew it without looking. The forked sigil stood beside it like a small rooted thing. An hourglass without sand might have served the same purpose, or a compass without needle. The symbol held the meaning that things in this valley acquired simply by surviving here. He let the low voices gather him. They did not speak to him directly, not yet. They spoke around him, across him, as if he were a fence post that reshaped the wind. There was a way the town shared its knowledge that made secrecy unnecessary. Truth here was not shouted or sung. It was breathed. It moved from mouth to ear in a vapor, condensed on the cool surfaces of counters and glass jars, and slid back into the air to be taken in again. The traveler listened and took the measure of what rose and fell in that breath. He heard the story of another arrival, a season or a year ago, told not with heat, but with the cool, balm-like cadence of a procedure completed. A cartwright, perhaps, or a woman who knew how to set bones. The details changed depending on who breathed them. The ending never did. The outsider had come up the same non-road and entered the same square. The town had named them, chalk and ink had agreed, and then, after a span of days counted in tasks, they had decided to stay. The phrase landed repeatedly with the soft thud of mallet on stake. Decided to stay. Not forced, not kept, not trapped, though the mountains were what they were and the forest did its looping tricks. Decided, as if the will could make of a snare a ring. A second whisper surfaced with the same smooth edges. No one could recall a leaving. It was not that a leaving had never happened. It was that memory would not take its imprint. The attempt slid through the mind like water through a fist. At the edges of the valley, recollection wore away as surely as trail markers weathered off their trees. People knew the dates of births and the order of harvests with a precision that would shame a surveyor. But when asked, when not asked, when breath simply turned to the question's shape, about departures, the lips formed sympathy and then some gentler reshaping of the story. The outsider had decided to stay. The phrase did all the lifting required. The traveler moved his attention without moving his head. At the rear of the shop, a door without a sign opened and closed with a hush like a book shutting on a secret. Those who went through carried the same absent expression on their return, the way a person looks when a tooth has been removed and the mouth takes inventory of the new emptiness. The door gave onto a back room that smelled of starch and old cedar. The floor there was cleaner than the front, the boards polished by the rhythm of feet that turned in place and faced one another. The outsider had decided to stay. The phrase did all the lifting required. The traveler moved his attention without moving his head. At the rear of the shop, a door without a sign opened and closed with a hush like a book shutting on a secret. Those who went through carried the same absent expression on their return, the way a person looks when a tooth has been removed and the mouth takes inventory of the new emptiness. The door gave onto a back room that smelled of starch and old cedar. The floor there was cleaner than the front, the boards polished by the rhythm of feet that turned in place and faced one another. He could picture the circle that formed there, chairs without arms, hands resting on knees, heads inclined. The same words moving at circumference until they became less a sentence than a shared heartbeat. Cult would have been a word from some other landscape, the kind printed in a city paper or laid on a courtroom table with photographs and exhibits. Here it was smaller and heavier, a weight worn until it shaped the body that carried it. He saw it in gestures subtle as a tide. Fingers touched to throat and then chest, 3 times, with a grace that suggested both prayer and inventory. Coins were absent, but tithing existed all the same in the distribution of hours. A morning given to the woods, an afternoon to the well, an evening to the circle. The bowl on the counter that held a handful of carved tokens, birch rounds inked with the forked mark, emptied and filled with a rhythm that did not correspond to purchase but to promise. In the glass behind the counter, faint and smudged, he saw his reflection stand among hanging lengths of rope and the boxed lids of mason jars. He had acquired the look of a person in whom decision is being grown, cell by cell, like a callus. The store recognized this stage. It had measures for it. A folded paper slid into an apron pocket near the ledger, and just as quietly a wrapped parcel appeared near his hand. Bread still warm, a wedge of hard cheese, a coil of wire, a stub of candle. No one asked payment. The tally inked itself elsewhere, in a place where coin would be useless. He took the parcel because reflex reaches for what is offered. The act of acceptance did not feel like a choice, it felt like gravity. At noon the bell above the door stirred to mark comings and goings with the restraint of a chaperone. A man with sawdust in his cuffs breathed the story again. Someone who had come in a spring of wet paths and damp boots, stayed, married, and taken up a name that fit into the town's braided rope without fray. A woman with vinegar on her sleeves breathed it too, with the addition that the outsider had carried a scar the mountain had softened. Each telling balanced on that same pivot, the decision to remain. Not a trap, then, if a dozen mouths called it a threshold stepped over with chosen feet. Yet the traveler had seen thresholds that looked like hospitality and felt like walls. A child crossed with a basket and left with an empty one. The child did not look at him, but oriented around him in the animal way of those taught to move through a known geography with an unknown boulder suddenly fallen across the path. The traveler understood that he was being placed, set within the town's arrangement like a tool slid into an empty slot. The slot had been cut long ago, its edges smoothed by the waiting. Afternoon thinned. The store's shadows lengthened and pleasing, orderly rows between the bins. A paper was pinned by the doorway, new since morning. It held a short litany of tasks and a column of names. His stood there with the forked sign beside it, scheduled beneath a word so homely it did not warn: listening. The time was marked by the only clock that mattered here, dusk. He felt the hook of the designation settle into him. Listening would not be optional because breath was not optional. He would belong to the circle at the hour when lamps began to honey the windows. He did not need to be told what he would hear. It would be the same stories turned until their edges shone, a kind of polish the town applied to every arrival until the surface took the same soft gleam. He stepped toward the back door when no one watched, and found, just beyond its threshold, a shelf set at heart height. It held a square of linen, a tray of pins, a coil of red thread, and a lidded jar. The lid lifted with a whisper as old as cedar, and inside lay small braids of hair, each tied with the same thread, each labeled in the shared hand. The labels carried the names of those who had decided to stay, and the dates of the decision, and beneath that the forked sign. The jar was not full, but it was tending in that direction, the way rivers tend toward oceans without ever hurrying. He replaced the lid and stood in the half-light of the storeroom. The breath of the circle rose through the boards from the other room. Not words now, not even the shapes of words, only the gentle, coaxing pressure of people arranging a story so it could carry the weight of living. He imagined how the circle cared for the memory of those who had thought of leaving. The memory would be padded and laid down. The edges would be smoothed. A different phrasing would be chosen. The town would not permit rupture where it could install narrative. When he returned to the front, the ledger had been closed and the pen laid precisely parallel to its spine. The bell rang once, soft enough to be apology. He stepped outside with his parcel, and the valley received him as a body receives breath it has already counted on. The chalkboard by the well bore fresh handwriting. The evening's assignments were arranged like seed in a furrow. His name had moved again, imperceptibly upward, toward the line where decisions were recorded in ink rather than chalk. Twilight washed the square in a tender gray. The traveler looked up at the ridge and tried to recall, with the clarity he usually reserved for maps and crossings, the shape of the road that would take him out. The memory tilted and slipped in his hands. It did not break, it dissolved. Behind him the general store exhaled through its rippled glass, and the sound folded into the rest of the town's breathing. Within those walls the phrase was being polished for him as surely as the bread had been wrapped. Those who arrive decide to stay. It came to him then that choice in this valley might be a plant grown in a controlled bed, watered, pruned, trellised, and shown the sun at certain hours. It might even bear fruit, sweet on the tongue. But its roots would never leave the box they were set in, and when the season came for harvest, the town would set the bowl on the counter, and hands would lift the tokens in the necessary number, and another name would be inked beside the fork. He stood at the well and felt the mountain's patience extend across him. He knew that later, when the lamps braided their gold into the evening, the circle would welcome him to listening. He knew, too, how the listening ended. The store had already breathed it to him. No one here could recall anyone leaving, and what cannot be recalled may as well have never been. The town did not argue with that fact. It sang to it without opening its mouth, and the mountain hummed along. The valley had a way of holding a man, of softening the sense of distance until direction itself seemed to dissolve. The traveler felt it more acutely with each day that passed. The hush of the lanes, the smoke that rose obediently from chimneys, the faces that never asked his name yet already bore it in their expressions. But unease works like a stone in the shoe. It grows sharper the longer it is endured. And so, when morning broke clear and cold, he chose to test the edges of this place. He would walk beyond it. He would find the road that had brought him in, or at least prove to himself that one still existed. The sun was just lifting when he left the square. Its light laid a pale glaze over rooftops and fences, but in the spaces between, shadows held firm. He followed the lane to its end, where the last house crouched against the slope. Beyond it, the tree line began, dense and upright, the pines packed as soldiers might be, shoulder to shoulder, their dark limbs interlocked. The earth underfoot softened, changing from packed clay to damp needles, and the smell of moss and wet bark thickened. At first, the forest seemed ordinary, quiet, but no quieter than the woods of any remote mountain. Roots snagged his boots, birds lifted in brief flights, and the wind tugged in restless currents above. He fixed his mind on the rhythm of walking, the way the path curved and narrowed. He took note of landmarks as any traveler would. A split trunk where lightning had struck years ago, a mossy boulder broad as a wagon, a leaning birch that pointed down slope like a bent finger. He marked them to memory, sure that his careful eye would keep him steady. The slope rose, then fell. The woods swallowed the sound of the village, leaving him alone with his own breath. Hours stretched thin, and he pressed onward, determined to cross the boundary of the valley. He imagined the ridge breaking open, offering a view of some distant valley beyond, or the faint line of a road etched into stone. But when the trees thinned and the light sharpened, he found himself staring at something he knew too well. The lightning-struck tree stood ahead of him, split and blackened, its wound scarred white with years. To the left crouched the mossy boulder, unchanged, its wet surface gleaming faintly. And there, leaning as it always had, the birch pointed down slope like a finger, urging him back. He stopped cold. His stomach turned with a slow realization. He had not turned at all. He had not wandered from his route, nor circled by accident. His steps had been forward, always forward, yet the forest had delivered him to his own beginning. He tried again. He walked faster this time, choosing another line, veering north, then east, trusting to the slope of the mountain to guide him outward. He scrambled over rocks slick with moss, waded through tangles of undergrowth, tore his sleeves on brambles. Hours passed, his breath grew sharp, his legs heavy. When the trees opened at last, he felt a moment of victory, until his eyes found the same markers waiting. The lightning-struck tree, the mossy boulder, the leaning birch. The traveler pressed his back against the stone and closed his eyes. The earth itself seemed to breathe beneath him, deep and slow, a pulse older than the town. The forest was no wilderness at all. It was a wall, a boundary dressed in roots and bark. It did not keep danger out, it kept life in. By late afternoon, frustration turned to dread. He tried once more, pushing higher this time, toward the ridge. The climb grew brutal, the incline sharper, the soil thin and sliding underfoot. Pines thinned to twisted shrubs, and stone teeth rose through the earth. He climbed until his hands bled, until his lungs burned with the thin air of altitude. He pulled himself onto a narrow ledge, heart hammering, convinced he had beaten the valley's grip. The view should have been wide, spilling into new country. Instead, it offered the familiar hollow. Below him lay the same scatter of rooftops, the same crooked well at the square's center, the same church spire rusted dark with age. The valley stretched no further than it had before. It was as if the mountain had folded back upon itself, curving into an endless loop. He descended, shaken. The sun had begun its fall by the time his boots found the valley floor again. The forest gave way to lanes, and the houses greeted him without surprise. Smoke lifted steadily from chimneys, as if nothing had shifted in his absence. Yet the people who moved about their work seemed to glance at him with the faintest trace of knowing. Not pity, not sympathy, but something quieter, older, recognition of a pattern repeating, as it always had. The traveler walked back into the square, hollow with exhaustion. His clothes were torn, his skin scraped, his body coated in the grime of the climb. No one asked what he had done. No one needed to. They looked at him and already understood. He was not the first to test the mountain's boundary, nor would he be the last. Near the well, the chalkboard stood as it always did, its columns freshly written. The list of names had shifted again, as if hands had been busy while he wandered. His own name sat higher now, paired with tasks he had not agreed to. Beside it, the forked sigil appeared twice, as though his attempt to leave had confirmed something in the town's design. He stared at the chalk, the lines clean and firm, and felt a tightness in his chest. The forest, he now knew, was no wilderness. It was a labyrinth drawn by forces older than mapmakers. It obeyed rules no compass could untangle. And the town, this strange lattice of families bound together by lineage, rested at its center, untouched by time, because time itself could not breach the walls of pine and stone. The traveler sank to the well's edge. Dusk lowered its veil, and lamps began to burn behind glass. He could hear the circle already gathering in the store's back room, their voices weaving the same story, the same refrain. Those who arrive decide to stay. He could almost hear the echo of his own attempt added to their breath, folded neatly into the pattern, as inevitable as nightfall. He thought of the forest looping him back, the ridge offering no escape, the town waiting with patient certainty. He thought of the names etched into ledgers and tombstones, all repeating, all bound. And he understood that he had not been exploring at all. He had been tested. The mountain had drawn its boundary, and he had pressed against it like an insect against glass, only to find there was no beyond. The valley was not a place on a map. It was the whole of a world. And now it was his. The valley, with its silence and smoke, had begun to settle into the traveler's bones like damp. Each morning brought the same cold light crawling down the slopes. Each evening the same veil of dusk wrapping the town in its narrow embrace. Yet it was not sameness alone that unnerved him. It was the sense that every step he took, every errand, every breath even, was part of a script already written. The general store, the church, the ledger, the chalkboard by the well, all of them bore his name now, inscribed with a certainty that left no room for argument. One evening, when the lamps had only just been lit and frost was beginning to form in the ruts of the lane, he slipped again into the store. He had no purpose beyond the tug of unease. The shopkeeper was nowhere in sight, yet the door remained unlocked, as if the town never feared intrusion. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and smoke, of burlap and candle grease. Shadows gathered in the corners, thickening with the dark outside. He wandered past the shelves until he reached the wall where the framed sheets hung. Their glass fronts caught the lamplight, reflecting dimly, as if each pane held a memory trapped beneath it. He drew closer. These were not ledgers of grain and oil, more tallies of goods traded. They were genealogies, names layered upon names, the braided record of a people who seemed less like families and more like branches of a single root. The traveler traced the columns with his eyes. The same surnames appeared again and again, stretching backward in time like echoes shouted down a canyon. But here and there, tucked into the lines like stray threads, other names appeared, odd, unfamiliar, carried in from elsewhere. Some looked like the names of merchants, foreign in rhythm and syllable. Others carried the harsh, clipped weight of soldiers. Still others bore the plain sound of drifters, wanderers, men and women without origin beyond the road. Each of these names, however, did not remain as strangers. They had been absorbed, married into families, rewritten into lines, their roots grafted until they were indistinguishable from the rest. A merchant who had arrived in the year of a hard winter had wed a daughter of the town within months. A soldier who wandered in after some distant war had fathered children whose surnames folded neatly into the existing weave. A woman whose origins were listed only as traveler had given rise to 3 lines of descent that repeated through every household. They had all come from beyond. They had all, in time, decided to stay. The traveler felt a cold sweat on his neck. He bent closer, and in the lower corner of one frame found a list of annotations, dates, and initials written in that shared hand. One line read, "The stranger stayed. His name endures in ours." Another, "She came from the road and was woven in, and her blood remains." The words struck him harder than any warning could have. They did not speak of capture or coercion. They spoke of inevitability, of a certainty so complete it required no justification. The town did not steal people, it absorbed them, as the forest absorbed fallen branches into its soil, as the mountain absorbed rivers into its stone. A draft moved through the store, and the traveler turned. In the far corner, beyond the counter, a chest stood half open. Its lid had been carved with the forked sigil, the same mark that followed his name wherever it was written. He stepped to it and pushed the lid wider. Inside lay bundles of papers, their edges browned with years, some folded, some rolled. He lifted one and unfolded it carefully. It was a page torn from a journal, the script hurried, the words broken by desperation. "I came from the north, seeking trade. The town took me in. They are kind, but I feel watched. They speak as if they know my thoughts. I cannot find the road again. I will try once more at dawn." He set it aside and opened another. "I was a soldier, left behind when my unit marched on. The mountain turned me about until I stumbled here. They say I am welcome. They say I belong. I think of the world beyond, yet my memory of it thins each day, as if it were smoke. My name is written in their book now. Perhaps that makes it true." Another sheet carried only a single line. "The forest has no edge. I am part of them now." The traveler let the pages fall back into the chest, heart pounding. The stories were not rumors. They were records, testimonies of those who had come before him, wanderers who had walked the same non-road, seen the same crooked well, and looked upon these same shelves with suspicion. Every one of them had struggled, every one had tried, and every one had been folded into the fabric of the town until their names were no longer theirs, but belonged to everyone. He stepped back, and his eyes lifted once more to the frames on the wall. The faces of the past seemed to stare through the glass, merchants with weary eyes, soldiers with scars, travelers with empty hands. Their names glowed faintly in the lamplight, no longer foreign, no longer separate. He thought of the cemetery. The stones aligned like ledger entries, each bearing names that belonged to everyone. The strangers were not strangers now, they were kin. The traveler left the store and stepped into the night. The square lay in silence, the well crouched at its center like a sentinel. Lamps burned behind shutters, casting long lines of gold across the dirt. The church bell, rusted and dark, seemed to hum faintly in the cold air, though no hand had struck it. He looked to the forest at the valley's edge, black against the stars. Somewhere beyond it lay the world he had known. Roads, towns, lives carried on without him. Yet as he strained to recall them, the memory felt thinner than it should have been. The details slipped, like water through his fingers. The sound of familiar names, the shape of distant places, they dimmed, as though distance itself was erasing them. The town's record was stronger than his own memory. He knew then what the others had learned before him. No one left because leaving was not a matter of feet and miles. It was a matter of being remembered, and the mountain remembered only inward. Once a name was written in the ledger, in chalk or ink or stone, the world beyond ceased to hold it. The traveler turned slowly in the square, his breath misting. He felt the weight of unseen eyes at windows, watching, not with menace but with patience. The town did not need to hurry. It had been here before, many times, with many wanderers. The pattern was old. The ending was already known. And as the night deepened, he could almost hear the whisper, not from any mouth, but from the very stones of the square. The stranger stayed. Moonless nights had a different weight in the valley. Without the coin of the moon to spend, darkness came in a single, unbroken currency that bought silence cheaply and bought secrecy dear. The traveler felt it gathering from afternoon onward, a pressure that thickened as lamps were lit behind shutters, and then, oddly, snuffed earlier than habit would dictate. Doors closed with the humility of prayer. The bell in the church tower did not ring. It did not need to. A cadence older than metal beat inside the hollow. He waited until the square emptied of the casual movements of evening. Frost had already filmed the well's rim, a pale ring like breath dried in place. The chalkboard stood wiped and written again. The columns were shorter tonight, the tasks few and private. His name wore the forked sign once more, not as assignment, but as notice. He took the hint the town had not bothered to hide. The work required no instruction in words. He kept to the lane's gutted shadows and followed where the air moved. It rose behind the church, through a gap in the fence where the posts had learned to lean, and into a path so faint the ground held it only out of respect for repetition. Pines closed over like folded hands. Rime silvered the needles. The smell of pitch was stronger here, drawn out of the trees by cold, as if the forest were preparing to heal a wound it expected to receive. Ahead, a thread of light unwound and rewound itself between trunks. Lanterns hooded and unhooded, their glow shown and hidden by practiced hands. Bodies made of wool and quiet passed without conversation. The traveler let them go on, then followed at a lag measured by his breath. Footfalls softened in frost and needles. No one looked behind. They did not need to. Their certainty moved in a circle that included everything. The path stepped upward through a notch in the ridge where wind usually worried the trees. Tonight the air slept. The world's sounds had gone inward, into heart and lung. The procession spilled into a clearing shaped by stubborn use. Stones stood there not as monuments but as tools. 3 uprights with a slab laid across them, weathered into a table by generations of weather and hands. The slab's surface bore grooves cut shallow, a trident pattern worn so smooth a palm could find the channels without sight. Around the stones the ground was tamped into rings, each ring familiar with the weight of feet walking it. Families arranged themselves where they always had, not by rank or age, but by kinship drawn into a geometry the traveler could not have charted and did not need to. The land knew the design and held it steady. Children were gathered like seeds in the cups of their elders' bodies. Faces were the patient attention he had come to recognize, an attention that gave nothing away because it had nothing left to conceal. Each person carried something ordinary until altogether it became more than the sum. A jar stoppered with wax, a coil of red thread, a bundle of willow switches, a wrapped loaf, a round of birch, a shallow bowl carved from burl. At the center of the tablestone, a basin already waited. It had been carried up earlier, perhaps by hands that left no trail, perhaps by the same hands that had made it from the heart of a fallen tree long before anyone here had a name apart from the mountain. Into that basin water was poured from a lidded crock. The water not from stream or snow, but drawn from the square's well at the hour when the town's reflection was clearest.
Ash followed, shaken from a dozen hearths into the surface until gray clouds drifted and dissolved. A stone from the cemetery hill, smoothed by too many thumbs, was set at the basin's lip, and with that addition the water seemed to steady, as if remembering why it was collected. No one spoke aloud. Words would have made the thing smaller.
Breath carried the work instead. The traveler felt the first exhalation lift and spread, one body offering warmth to the cold world so that some other warmth could be coaxed forth. The sound was not a chant and not a song. It had no shape that could be translated, only a pulse that negotiated terms with the night. The jar of braids came forward next, its cedar lid unscrewed with a turn that sounded exactly like a door on a familiar house opening. Inside lay the same careful lengths he had seen in the store's back room, each tied with a thread the color of dried blood, each labeled in the shared hand. A braid was lifted, and then another, and laid across the trident grooves on the stone as if set to measure their alignment. Wax warmed over a small lamp, and dripped to seal each in place for the space of a breath, not to hold it fast, but to acknowledge its passage through this moment. The smell was faintly sweet, carrying the low animal note of hair singed at the edge of heat. The mountain took that note and did not object. Tokens of birch were set in a shallow wooden tray, a circle of rounds, each burned with the forked mark, each inscribed on the underside with a name. The tray traveled the ring of families, balanced on two palms that never faltered. When it reached the table, each token was lifted and held an instant in the low lantern light. Then it was let go into the basin's dark surface. Some lay flat and drifted, some tilted, turned, and sank. The traveler watched the tiny whirlpools close over them like mouths making a promise. When his turn arrived, he did not know until his skin tightened as if a hand had closed around his chest from the inside. A birch round was held. The burnt fork glowed like a coal. On the underside, his name existed in that same even hand, arranged with a certainty that asked nothing of him. A braid was set beside it, a color he recognized because he had seen it on his own pillow in the morning, a subtle signature only a mirror could confirm. He felt the nakedness of being known by such a small, incontrovertible detail. The braid was tied with red, knotted once, twice, 3 times. The knot's logic belonged to sailors and weavers and people who keep what they love from being carried away by the river. The round was released. It kissed the water and rested. For a moment it spun, indecisive, as if consulting the shallow currents of ash and breath and well. Then, almost tenderly, it listed and slid down into the dark. The surface closed with the neatness of the ledger being shut for the night. A fine tremor moved through the clearing that was not wind. It ran through boots and ankles, up bones, into teeth and eyes. It was the feeling of a boundary acknowledging maintenance, the way a fence hums very slightly when its posts are checked and the wire retensioned. The traveler knew without needing to be told that the basin did more than carry names. It carried the bargain that kept the valley enclosed. The water was memory concentrated. The ash was time shared. The stone of the cemetery was debt. Hair was lineage. The thread was consent expressed in the only language the place honored, the body itself. And breath was the currency that bought the right to ask anything at all of the mountain. Willow switches bound in a sheaf made the next circuit. They touched shoulders and crowns and the shallow of the back where the body learns burden. The taps were measured, 3 upon each person, aligned to the 3 grooves cut into the slab, aligned to the 3-pronged sign that had followed him from chalkboard to ledger to lintel. The switches left no mark except a wakefulness, a prick of the skin where the boundary laid its finger and said, "Here." Lanterns, no more than a dozen, circled outward and returned, snuffing and relighting as they passed certain stones. The sequence drew lines in the dark the eye could not follow, but the body understood. At some inflection point, the church bell in the valley below gave a small sound not born of rope or hand, but of sympathy, iron responding to a note struck in stone. The sound was soft as the slip of a ring onto a finger. It traveled up through the path of their inhalations and settled where thought ends and acceptance begins. The traveler stayed crouched within the brush as the clearing's edge, knees cold in frost, hands braced on the mat of needles. He could have stood and stepped forward. No one would have stopped him because no one needed to. This was not a theater of persuasion, but of recognition. The ceremony acknowledged what already existed, a system of belonging that long ago found fiercer means too costly, and so taught itself to be inevitable instead. When the basin had taken what it would take, when the braids had been warmed and sealed and unsealed, when the willow had woken every back to the line it would carry tomorrow and the day after, the families unwound themselves from the shape and became lanes of people again. The threads of red were gathered into a single coil and hung upon a peg driven into the slab's side. The peg was blackened and smooth, older than any living hand by at least a generation. The hair jar was stoppered. The tray of tokens, now lighter by several rounds, was covered with a cloth. A pinch of ash was thrown to the four sides of the clearing, where compass has no power. One by one, the lanterns were hooded, hands closing their light the way eyelids close on certainty. Dark expanded to fill every gap. Boots shifted frost in a new pattern that would freeze by morning and give a second record of attendance for anyone who read such particulars. The procession began its descent. Breath rose in small, steady plumes that looked like thought escaping and refusing to look back. He let them pass until the clearing was only a memory, wrapped around cold. The tablestone remained, blind and certain. He stood and went to it because curiosity persists even after lessons are given. The grooves were slick with condensed breath and damp ash. In the basin, the water reflected stars that were not visible through the pines. He bent and saw, for the briefest instant, a face that looked like his and did not older or younger, just belonging in a way he could not explain. He straightened before the image could fix itself in him. The path down felt different without bodies ahead to give it measure. He moved by the smell of resin and the faint iron memory of the bell. The town reassembled below as a cluster of small, deliberate suns behind glass. Doors opened and closed. Beds accepted weight. A dog shook once to re-enter itself. Somewhere a ledger's ribbon was laid carefully between pages. In the square, the chalkboard had been rewritten during the time he was gone, though no hand had passed him. Columns shortened further. His name, lifted into the night's work, had been given a third fork beside it, inked in a darker stroke that bled slightly into the chalk dust and made a halo. The frame of the board was damp with frost. The letters beaded and ran. He touched nothing. Touching would have amounted to an argument he could not win. He crossed the lane to his narrow bed and lay down without undressing. The smell of smoke was in the weave of the blanket, the kind that does not wash out but moves with a person into the next season. Sleep came as it had begun to come here, not as a fall but as a graft, silent, purposeful, leaving him unsure in the morning where the cut had been made. He recognized the new heaviness in his chest for what it was. It was not despair, nor consent, nor even the comfort of belonging. It was the weight of being accounted for. Above the valley, the clearing emptied itself of heat and forgot nothing. In the basin, the dark water held round things that would soften and go to pulp and feed some smaller life living in the cracks. The mountain accepted the offering with the patience of stone. The boundary, retensioned, hummed. By dawn, frost silvered the well again. The traveler rose to a town that looked the same and was not. He walked past the chalkboard without needing to read it to know what had been written. He had seen how the writing was made. He had watched the hand that moved even when no hand moved at all. Morning rose gray and thin, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to touch the valley. The traveler woke with the sensation that something had shifted, though his room was unchanged. The same rough boards, the same blanket carrying the stubborn scent of smoke. But the air carried a weight heavier than before, as though the town had spent the night drawing in a breath too large to hold much longer. He stepped outside. Frost traced every fence rail and rooftop, a delicate lacework that seemed both fragile and permanent. People moved about their tasks with their usual thrift of motion, but beneath their silence there was an undertone, a vibration like the low hum of a hive. It was not speech, yet it was a communication all the same. The traveler walked the square, his boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt. His eyes were drawn to the church spire. The bell had not rung in all his time here, but now he thought he understood why. Sound was unnecessary when presence itself was the instrument. The bell's silence was not neglect, it was obedience. He found himself pulled toward the cemetery hill. He had walked its rows before, studying the repetition of names, the way strangers had become kin by record if not by blood. But this time he noticed something new. The stones seemed to lean, ever so slightly, not with the random sag of age, but with a common slant, as though all of them were bowing toward the same direction, inward, toward the center of the valley. Even the dead were pulled, unwilling or not, into the gravity of the town. At the heart of the graveyard stood the oldest stone, weathered to near illegibility. The grooves of its carving had softened until they looked more like natural fissures than human letters. He ran a hand over its surface and felt not words but shapes, 3 prongs branching from a single stem. The forked mark, older than ledgers, older than chalkboards, older even than memory. The stone did not speak, but the earth beneath it did. A tremor moved through his body, faint as the brush of a moth's wing, yet undeniable. It was not sound, not sight, not smell. It was a knowing. The mountain itself carried a hunger, and the town existed to feed it. Each family line, each braid of hair tied and preserved, each token sunk into the basin in the hills, all of it was a tithe, a contract, not spoken but breathed, not signed but lived. The truth settled on him slowly, like snow falling on a roof. The people of the valley could not leave, not because of locked gates or watchful eyes, not because of fear or devotion, but because the mountain would not permit it. Their lives were bound to this place by a covenant so old that even those who enacted it no longer remembered the beginning. He thought of the forest, how it had turned him back upon himself, how every attempt to leave ended where it began. The trees were not merely guardians, they were the visible edge of the covenant, a boundary drawn in bark and stone. Beyond them lay not freedom, but death. For if one crossed the boundary, the bond between body and land would sever. And when that bond broke, the body would wither, collapsing like a husk drained of its marrow. The traveler recalled scraps he had overheard in the store, words spoken in tones so hushed they were barely breath, of someone who had faded on the ridge, of another who had grown thin and hollow after attempting the woods. No one called it death, not outright. They called it withering, as if the body did not end so much as unravel, piece by piece, until nothing recognizable remained. This, then, was the price of their survival. The town endured through famine, through winters that would have emptied lesser places, through storms that erased whole roads beyond the mountain. It endured because its people never left. The land held them, drew from them, kept them bound. Their presence was the offering. Their living bodies, rooted here, were the sustenance the mountain demanded. He staggered back from the old stone, his breath fogging the air. Around him, the graves seemed to lean closer, as though listening for his recognition. He turned and looked down into the valley. The houses crouched in their ordered lines, smoke rising in delicate threads. The traveler recalled scraps. He turned and looked down into the valley. The square's well gleamed with a frozen rim, its water black and bottomless. It was not a town at all. It was a vessel built to hold life, to contain it, to feed it slowly into the mountain's unseen mouth. The traveler walked back down the hill, his legs weak beneath him. He saw the faces of the townsfolk more clearly now. Their silence was not emptiness, it was maintenance. Every glance, every quiet task, every breath given to the air was part of the pact. They did not resist it, because to resist was to unravel. They lived not out of freedom, but out of necessity, each body a thread woven tightly into the fabric of the place. He understood, too, why outsiders never left. It was not choice alone, nor was it kindness that absorbed them. The covenant required replenishment. Strangers who stumbled in were not accidents. They were gifts the mountain allowed, offerings brought to sustain the weave. Each one, sooner or later, was folded into the pattern, their name inked in ledgers, their braid tied with red thread, their token sunk into the basin. The mountain demanded continuity, and continuity was fed by blood both old and new. By the time he reached the square, the weight of the truth had settled fully. He looked at the chalkboard by the well, at his own name written there with its forked sigil. He realized it was not a record of tasks. It was an account of tethering, a visible mark of the invisible knot. His life was already tied here, strand by strand. The traveler sank to the stone rim of the well and closed his eyes.
He imagined what would happen if he defied it, if he tried again to walk into the forest. He would not be chased nor struck down. He would simply weaken. His breath would thin, his limbs would falter, his body would hollow until it crumbled like a dried husk left too long in the sun. The land would reclaim him, not out of malice, but out of hunger, and the town would endure, as it always had. A lantern flickered in a nearby window, its flame steady, patient. Somewhere a child laughed once, the sound sharp and short, then cut away by a parent's hush. The traveler listened, and for the first time he heard it not as life, but as offering. Each laugh, each breath, each heartbeat, they were the mountain's feast. The curse was not punishment, it was arrangement. The town lived so long as no one laughed, and if anyone tried, they ceased to be. It was that simple, that complete, that final. He opened his eyes to the square, to the spire that pointed at a sky too vast to acknowledge them, to the well that drank reflections and gave nothing back. The traveler felt the knot of the covenant draw tighter around him. He could not untie it. No one could. And so he understood at last the reason they never leave. Because they cannot. Because to remain is to live, and to step beyond is to feed the mountain in another way. The valley held him, the way it had held countless others before, and it would go on holding, forever, until the mountain's hunger outlasted even stone. The night came with a heaviness that felt rehearsed, as though the valley had been waiting for this exact hour since his first step upon its soil.
The air was bitter, carrying the scent of pine smoke and resin, the cold biting down like a jaw that would not loosen. The traveler felt it in his bones as he walked toward the square, guided not by his own intent, but by the rhythm of the town itself. Doors had opened earlier than usual, and figures streamed silently from them, moving in calm procession. He had not been summoned with words, yet his feet carried him in their wake. At the square center, where the crooked well crouched, a bonfire had been raised. The wood was stacked in a design too deliberate to be accident, crossed and braced until the flames could only rise in one direction, upward, hungry and unwavering. The fire roared with a strength that seemed to reach beyond mere timber, tongues of orange and white rising high, as though licking the very roof of the valley. Sparks rushed into the night sky, vanishing into the folds of the mountain darkness. The townsfolk gathered in a wide ring around it, faces lit in a stuttering glow. Shadows stretched long and leaned inward, their bodies doubled and tripled in the fire's light until it seemed the circle contained far more than the living. Their eyes did not shine with joy or malice, but with something older, something settled. The look of people who had done this countless times and would do it countless more. The traveler stood among them, though he could not recall walking to his place. A cup had been pressed into his hand earlier, its rim warm with spiced drink. He had swallowed it without thought, the taste heavy with honey and something bitter hidden beneath. Now his body responded strangely. His limbs felt distant, his breath shallow. The fire swayed and doubled before his eyes, the flames blurring into one long serpent of light. It dawned on him, slow and dreadful, that he had been softened, drugged into compliance. The warmth in his veins was not comfort, but surrender, a surrender written into him without his permission. His body betrayed him with a treacherous calm, his heartbeat too steady, his muscles too slack. He tried to step back, but his legs responded as though they belonged to another. The ring of townsfolk closed tighter, a family folding around its newest child. Voices rose, not in speech, but in a low rhythmic hum. It was the same sound he had heard at the ceremony in the hills, the breath-borne pulse that needed no translation. It filled the square, wrapped itself around the fire, wove through his ears until it reached the marrow of his bones. The vibration moved inside him, aligning him, turning his resistance into silence. He realized with a sinking clarity that this was not persuasion, this was instruction. His body was being taught its new place, its new rhythm, the way a bone is set to heal crooked if bound incorrectly. Through the haze, his eyes fell upon the chalkboard near the well. Its columns had been wiped clean, save for one line. His name. Written bold and centered, the forked sigil drawn thrice beside it, dark and final. The town had finished its record of him. There was no column left for tasks, no line left for choice. The board no longer described work, it described belonging. The hum grew deeper, thickened by the fire's roar. A hand brushed his shoulder, steady and heavy, and he recognized it not as comfort but as anchoring. Others followed, hands settling on his arms, his back, his head. He was held without chains, bound by flesh to flesh. Their warmth bled into him, their breath moved through him, until he could not tell where his body ended and theirs began. The fire's smoke climbed higher, carrying with it the smell of resin and something else, sweet, almost cloying. It dulled the edges of thought, dragging his mind into murk. Images slipped into him unbidden, the lightning-struck tree, the mossy boulder, the leaning birch, all circling endlessly. The graveyard stones bowing toward the valley, the basin in the hills swallowing his token. His name written again and again in ledgers and records, in chalk and ink and carved stone. It had always been there, waiting for him. He saw himself not as he was, but as the town saw him, a line on a page, a thread woven into a braid, a voice added to a circle. He was no longer a traveler. He was continuity. He was nourishment. The realization came late, too late, and yet it settled with the certainty of truth. He had been undone not by force, but by patience. The town had not needed to chase him. It had only needed to wait, and waiting was what it did best. His resistance had been catalogued, his rebellion absorbed, his attempts to escape folded into the same refrain. The stranger stayed. The fire roared higher, sparks scattering into the night like seeds. The hum swelled and deepened, and he felt his lips moving with it, though no command had been given. The sound rose from his chest without his will, the same note as the rest, the same cadence, until his voice was indistinguishable from theirs. His throat vibrated with the town's rhythm, his body aligned to its pattern. He tried to resist, one last desperate push, but his thoughts were drowned in smoke and sound. His eyes lifted to the fire, and in its center he saw not flame but the mountain's heart, open and consuming. He understood now why the people never left, not merely because leaving meant death, but because staying meant erasure in a slower, quieter way. To remain was to dissolve into the collective until the self was no longer separate. Around him, faces glowed in firelight, their expressions calm, unwavering. Each bore the same look, the look of those who had once fought and lost, who now stood as part of the whole. Their hands pressed more firmly upon him, sealing him, fixing him in place. The traveler felt his thoughts scatter like ash. His name no longer felt foreign on their lips. It was theirs now, not his. He was family, not by blood, but by absorption, by curse, by covenant. The fire swelled, the hum broke into silence, and in that silence he knew it was complete. He was no longer a visitor, no longer a wanderer, no longer himself. He was one of them, and the town endured.